To say the situation for the American Marines at Chosin was dreadful to say the least. A 30,000 strong force of Americans, British, and Koreans were encamped around the mountainous regions of Korea. They have been advancing and pursuing North Korean forces for weeks. Although the Chinese joined the war on the Korean side some days earlier, UN forces were confident from their successes. But on the night of November 27th, 1950, they would receive a nasty surprise. A nasty surprise of 120,000 soldiers sent by Mao Zedong himself. For the average American today, if you bring up the topic of the Korean War, you might be met with confusion or people who barely know anything about the conflict. They might know it's the reason why North and South Korea were still separated. The war took place before Vietnam, and the conflict was and is a stalemate. The conflict is so barely known, it is sometimes known as the Forgotten War, if you talk to more people who know more about the war itself. Well, in my opinion, the Korean War was among the most important conflicts of the 24th century. Uh, it was a major test of integrity of the recently then founded United Nations, was a stepping stone for American, Soviet, and Chinese foreign policies, and more civilians were killed in World War II and Vietnam combined, and destroyed the economy of North Korea. That's why it seems so. It's one of the reasons why it seems so, so bad today, is like so bleak, is that so because of the bombing campaign that we did against North Korea and a bunch much more stuff. Well, for even though I would like to talk about the Korean War in its entirety, I think there is one event that I would like to focus on more: the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. Along with the Korean War, it is often not talked about. Um, it was fought in late November and early December 1950, so pretty early in the war. It is known for being an incredibly brutal battle. Like it was, it was. Since it was fought in the winter, temperatures were as low as negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything liquid froze. Medical equipment such as plasma, morphine froze, fuel froze, even vehicle batteries froze, and guns malfunctioned. Um, and this whole time, as I said in the beginning, UN forces were outnumbered by the Chinese and surrounded and encircled. Um, since a battle is within a war, the war itself must be talked about. So let's talk about some context. Uh, So Korea in the early 1900s was ruled by the Japanese Empire. Ja- um, so the Japanese Empire was relatively late to the imperialism game. So like late 1800s, but they incredibly modernized. They took inspiration from European institutions, such as parliamentary systems and that good stuff, and they had modern European weapons, and they were looking to expand. So one of their first targets was Korea. I think it was actually their first expansion target. Anyways, their first target was Korea, and it was an incredibly cruel regime. The Japanese, they stamped out Korean culture by banning the Korean language, educating Koreans with Japanese systems, stealing historical artifacts, banning newspapers printed in Korean. Uh, so the so the Japanese they wanted to assimilate the Koreans into Japanese culture. Um, in the 40s, the Japanese were eventually defeated in World War II, as we all know, and Korea was split in two in 1945. In the north, Soviet troops came from Manchuria and established uh, a socialist regime, while Americans came in from the south and established theoretically a democratic and capitalist country. Um, Soviets later left in 1948, Americans a year later. Um, North Korea came to be controlled by the totalitarian communist Kim Il Sung, and South Korea was ruled by the authoritarian Syngman Rhee. Uh, as you might have guessed already, there was mainly bad blood between the two. Each dictator wanted to take over the other. Communist guerrillas immediately began to operate in South Korea in the mountains, supported by North Korea later on. And South Korea would, round up communist sympathizers and give them harsh prison sentences or even execute them. Meanwhile, this is going on. Korea wasn't really a major focus for the Soviet Union and the United States, and this is when the Cold War just barely started. Uh, After Nazi Germany and the rest of the Axis were defeated in World War II, there came to be two superpowers, as I mentioned before: the United States and the Soviet Union. And despite being allies, they have totally different um, governing systems, ideologies, and strategic goals that conflict with each other. Um, the U.S. had the advantage early on in the Cold War, like really early on, because they developed the atom bomb. So if the Soviet Union did anything stupid, then we'll use the nuke to dissuade them or use. Uh, we also had a initiative in the Cold War from the Berlin Airlift, which you don't know was a massive air campaign that relieved Berlin from the Soviets, because remember Germany was split at this time. So it was all fine. Well, it was still early on, but it was kind of sliding in American favor. But it later turned into nothing when the Soviets tested their own nuclear bomb in 1950. So the Soviets began to feeling more confident, and in China, the Civil War was finally over. Mao Zedong, the communist we all know, took over, and Stalin, the chairman of the Soviet Union, felt more confident that he could do something about, uh, uh, assert his power for the Soviet Union, and he began to look at Korea. He looked at the Chinese Civil War. We did provide support for democratic forces, but we uh, didn't intervene directly. And Stalin was uh, thought that was a hint that America wouldn't intervene in Korea. So he gave the green light to Kim Il-sung, remember the dictator of North Korea, to invade South Korea. Besides us not intervening in the Chinese Civil War, Soviet intelligence actually found out that we weren't interested in Korea at all, because we were paying attention to different regions in Europe, and North Korea believed that South Korean forces were weak. There was little equipment, and the communist guerrillas were sapping South Korea of manpower. And China would also assured Kim Il Sung that they would provide support. So in 1950, early 1950, North Korean armies began their preparations. While this was going on, we were confident that North Korea wouldn't invade South Korea, and we weren't really interested in the region as a whole, so we didn't really pay that much attention. But we did send advisors to train the Republic of Korea, ROK for short, soldiers. We were so confident about the situation that one commander said that a North Korean invasion would be quote-unquote target practice. However, America was surprised when on 25th of June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. They were skirmishing at the border for quite some time, but this was the real deal. North Korea claimed that the Republic of Korea attacked them first, and said that the KPA, Korean People's Army, for short, would arrest the bandit traitor Sigmund Rhee. So that's the reason why they would further advance into Korea, like South Korea. So initially the advance was swift. It was like no contest. ROK forces numbered around 98,000, while the KPA was 150,000. And North Koreans had another decisive advantages in equipment in their Soviet-provided tanks. ROK forces had very few anti-tank equipment to deal with the tanks, so they couldn't really do anything but except retreat. So within a few days of the invasion, the capital of South Korea, Seoul, fell to the KPA. Capitalizing on this, KPA continued to push south, and it seemed like the war was going to be over. While this was going on, we were hesitant on what to do about the situation, but the Truman Doctrine, or the fallen domino theory, began to take hold in United States foreign policy at the time. Is basically the theory that if a country falls to a communist takeover, then they'll embolden communists everywhere else. So we figured that we could do something about the situation, or we had to do something. So we persuaded the UN to pass a resolution that all members of the UN should send support for South Korea. Normally, if the Soviet Union would normally veto this, since they had a permanent seat in the Security Council, but they were actually boycotting the UN Security Council at the time because communist China was still not recognized as the quote-unquote real China. The Republic of China, now known as Taiwan, is on the island of Taiwan, and we haven't really shifted the Chinese quote-unquote recognition to communist China yet. But anyways, I digress. The United States and many other countries, we quickly began to send more units to South Korea. South Korea and American troops, like a few hundred of them, immediately were sent from Japan, and they set up a defensive line in the southwest of the country, referred to as the Pusan Perimeter. They were holding out for quite a while, and then the UN reinforcements began to arrive and bolstered the defenses, repelling all KPA attacks. However, a counterattack must be made against the KPA to relieve the perimeter and drive the KPA out of South Korea once and for all. The place that would begin the counteroffensive is the port of Incheon, to the west of Seoul. So, Pusan is in the southeast, and Incheon is to the northwest. The attack was risky, but General MacArthur, the brain, the genius behind this whole plan, if you know anything about MacArthur, he was bold and risky, so this was not out of the question for him. He wanted the assault to take place on Incheon, but other commanders and the government itself of the U.S. didn't really like that idea because unknown amount of troops, or what if, like, the invasion is disaster, a whole bunch of unknowns and other factors that made Incheon not really a good place. But MacArthur ignored them and launched the attack on Incheon anyways on September 15th, 1950. This was all known as the UN Summer Counteroffensive, when Incheon and later in the season that will be known as the Summer Counteroffensive. So September 15th, 1950, 40,000 Marines, infantry, and Koreans landed in Incheon after several days of bombarding the area and faced light resistance from the KPA. If I remember correctly, there's only like a few hundred North Koreans in the area, or KPA rather. So it was pretty easy to take over Incheon and drive to the east. So a day later, after the Incheon landing, UN forces launched their own breakout operation from the Pusan perimeter. North Korea's tanks, when the UN forces started to get the anti-tank equipment, the tanks started to be decimated from the equipment, and the U.S. mostly had a decisive hand in air power, so they can easily bomb supply lines or KPA troops themselves. So the North Korean forces, they had to retreat. They were outnumbered, as I said before, outgunned and outmatched by the U.S. Air Force and troops themselves. And on September 15th, the 25th, Seoul was recaptured by the UN and continued to advance into North Korea itself. Chinese diplomats warned that if the UN forces crossed the border of what is referred to as the 38th parallel, Chinese forces would intervene. These warnings were ignored by High Command, and UN forces crossed the border on the 1st of October, 1950. We were confident. We were confident that they wouldn't intervene. Plus, we were too concerned about Chinese intervention at first. So, as in the summer counteroffensive, we quickly secured key cities and captured the North Korean capital on the 15th of October, 1950. General MacArthur had a plan of total occupation and annihilation of the KPA, so he wanted to completely occupy North Korea, and it seems to be his goal would be achieved. However, Chinese say true to their warnings, and Chinese armies began to cross the North Korean border on the 19th of October and attacked Korean soldiers a week later. Yun Kai command was still not convinced that the Chinese intervened and wanted to fully secure North Korea once and for all. They launched another offensive that would theoretically bring troops home for Christmas. And the 10th Corps, the guys we will focus on today, were sent to advance northeast and set up positions at the Chosin Reservoir in late November. During that year, it was extremely chilly. A cold front moved from Siberia into Korea, and temperatures got as low as negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit at Chosin. Frostbite was obviously, as you can figure, common. As I said before, liquids froze, car batteries froze. The area was extremely mountainous, and the reservoir was a man-made lake made during the Japanese Empire times. During the times of the Japanese Empire, in fact. The 10th Corps was composed of the destroyed 1st Marine Division, 3rd, 7th Infantry Divisions. Also with the American forces were quite a few British Marines and Korean infantrymen. An estimated 10% of all American forces during the Korean War were actually veterans from World War II. So this stuff was, they were quite used to these conditions and everything. Chosin reminded several of the Battle of the Bulge, another super cold, wintry battle in World War II. I'll have my editor provide a map here so I can easily see what's going on, or the layout of the Chosin region itself. So to the north of the man-made lake was the village of Udamni, garrisoned by the 7th Marine Regiment and elements of the 5th Marines Regiment. To the south of Udamni were the rest of the 5th Marines controlling the Tokton Pass, the only road leading to the south. To the east of that lake was RCT 31, which is short for Regimental Combat Team. So Regimental Combat Team 31 was like a few thousand men, but they were stretched thin. Like, he had to cover the entire east of the lake, but they really weren't concerned with Chinese troops at the time. So they stretched out from the northeast of the lake to the southern village of Hudangni. To the south of both sides were the village of Hugarui. So, if you're not looking at the map, so imagine like a Y. So the left branch or line of the Y is Udamni, and to the right line is the area of RCT 31. And when those two lines come to merge into a single line, that's where Hugarui is approximately at. And Hugarui is going to be incredibly important for the battle up ahead. It was a supply depot and the headquarters of the 1st Marine Division itself. And continuing south of Hugarui was a river valley. Along the valley were vital villages Kotori and Shinghongni. The valley had the only road leading back to the port of Hungnam, where the 10th Corps arrived through. So before they were transported from South Korea, from Busan, I believe, and then they were sent into the port of Hungnam. And I don't think there was any resistance, so they quickly drove through, and now they're at the Chosin Reservoir. And on the night of the 27th of November, the Marines at Udamni and the Tokton Road were surprise attacked by Chinese soldiers. These Chinese soldiers, the divisions, they scaled the mountains to the west, and they began to attempt to circle and sweep the Marines at Udamni. The Chinese forces, however, they had outdated weapons and poor supplies, but they were determined to accomplish their goals. At Udamni, the UN Marines and the Chinese were locked in brutal hand-to-hand fighting over the ridges to the north and northwest of the area. And south of Udamni, at the Tokton Road, it was not a similar story. The Marines began to be scattered by the Chinese 59th Division, The companies either retreated into Udamdi or were isolated on the hill overlooking the Tokton Pass. So the Marines at Udamni, they're cut off, and a bunch of other smaller companies were isolated near the Tokton Pass on a bunch of hills. To the east, RCT-31 was caught in complete shock. They were completely outmatched and were swiftly encircled and split into 3 different groups. 2 elements were isolated in the hills in the north, and the other part near Hungnandi. The Chinese were elated with success in the area since they believed that there were much more. They had much more. They believed that there was much more UN soldiers present in the area than they previously believed. So on the morning of November 28th, combat. So starting tonight and is continued into the morning of the 28th. The Marines at Udamni were able to repel Chinese attacks for now, and they had to dig in to create better defenses. Opposed to the east, the Chinese command actually believed that only a lighter force guarded Udamni, so they thought most of the UN soldiers were near Hudangni, while they only believed some of them were in Udamni, so they concentrated. Believe they didn't really commit much to attack at Udamni. Chinese divisions began to arrive near Hugaruri during the dawn. So imagine like a huge sweeping motion. Again, look at the map, but a huge sweeping motion from the west of Chinese soldiers and trying to cut off and isolate UN Marines at Udamdi, Hugaruri, and the other places. So the Chinese began to arrive near Hugaruri during the dawn, but they were too late. So they were intended to attack at the same time of the divisions north of them at Udamni, but they got lost in the countryside, so like in the mountains and different areas. So this bought time for the Americans to prepare, since they were actually so low on manpower. They had to conscript all service personnel with minimal combat training to the front line, so like cooks, probably medical personnel. So anybody that could fight, they would grab them and shove them to the front line, so to speak. And despite all the time that the American defenders got, they were actually overwhelmed. The Chinese soldiers. So while we were retreating, the Chinese soldiers, since they were starving and inadequate equipment, they set to looting the camps. And this bought more time for the Marines to rally and launch a counterattack that kicked back the Chinese forces, and we were able to set up a more defensible positions near Hugaruri. Back to the east, the Chinese believe that the RCT-31 had been completely annihilated, as near Hugaruri, they began to loot the camps for like equipment and food. And when it became morning, one of the isolated groups of Marines counterattacked the Chinese regiment near a river. The Chinese were caught off guard and they had to retreat. To kick them back again, the Chinese launched another assault on RCT-31, and the RCT-31, since they were completely outmatched, they only had like about 2,000 soldiers, and that's even less now with all the fighting that's going on. They did have an ace up their sleeve, which was the anti-aircraft guns they mounted on some trucks, so they can easily move them around, and they would like blast them at incoming Chinese assaults. So the anti-aircraft guns were carrying the Marines right now. Throughout the battle, when it was night, the Chinese, they would use psychological tactics to demoralize the Marines. These tactics, the Chinese, they will learn from their time. The communist Chinese, they will learn from their times in the Civil War, and they learned that psychological tactics worked a lot. So during the night, they would sound bugles, they would clash cymbals and shriek whistles every single day, even during combat. Chinese soldiers were determined to achieve their objectives, and actually some veterans who fought at the battle recalled that when one Chinese soldier went down, a dozen more would just simply take their place. So they just kept on coming and coming and coming during their assaults. And conditions got even more worse at Chosin for everybody, since it was so cold that you had to keep moving all the time to keep your blood circulating. So if you don't stay moving, and the blood does not circulate, then your blood will simply freeze, and frostbite and hypothermia would occur. So all the front lines, I might make them seem to be that they're static throughout the days. They weren't really. It was constantly back and forth over hills, different areas. So the front lines were constantly in flux. So yeah, it was pretty brutal. So when the 29th November came, they realized that if Hugari is captured, Udamni and RCT-31 are basically screwed. So from the river valley in the south, and Kotori and the other villages in the area, they would scrap together a task force called Task Force Drysdale, named after the British commander. So about 921 guys moved up north. Since it was so cold, trucks shut down, and just generally the weather in general stopped the marching, fast marching that much. They stopped fast marching. And Chinese soldiers also got into the area. They will launch ambushes on the advancing column, which slowed down progress even more. It was so bad. The valley became known as Hellfire Valley. So imagine walking through negative 36 degrees, walking through the snow, a bunch of other guys with you, but then you would get attacked by Chinese soldiers constantly. So it was pretty brutal. John Lee, a Korean interpreter assigned to the ROK Army to the 1st Marine Division, was present during the march and remembered that, quote, Chinese bullets were flying like rain, and nobody dared to climb on the truck. He was near a truck at the time. And nobody dared to climb on the truck, pick up the ammunition and throw it to the soldiers. Then all of a sudden I saw a sergeant. The truck was burning and he was throwing ammunition to the troops and pushing wounded soldiers off the truck. Then he was hit, killed right in front of us. So Task Force Drysdale was able to make it on November 29th during the night to Hugari, but it was completely decimated. Only about 300 combat-ready guys made it out of 921. So yeah, it was that bad, going up the valley from the cold and Chinese ambushes. RCT-31 had some success, actually. Heavily outnumbered, they were able to break through an encirclement, one of the groups, and connect with one of their companies. That was all the progress they made during that day. And back to Udamni, there was an attempt to rescue the company isolated on the Tokton Hills on the 27th. Despite they inflicted a lot of heavy casualties on the Chinese divisions there, but they were unable to rescue the isolated soldiers. There was no attack on Udamni itself, since the Chinese commander Song Shulun deduced that there was a larger force present than previously believed, like in the east. While the Chosin Reservoir battle was going on, this was basically the same story for everywhere in the front line during the week. Nearby, there was another battle taking place at, this is a pretty long name, Shungshan River, where the rest of the 8th Army UN forces were beaten back. General MacArthur eventually figured out he had to retreat, so he ordered withdrawal of the 10th Corps to the port of Hunan, so they can be evacuated. So on November 30th, this order was received. The commander of the 10th Corps actually remarked about the evacuation orders. Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in different directions. There was some concern and some morale loss because of the evacuation, but the morale doesn't really seem to be an important factor, as we're going to find out soon. So the plan was this. The 10th Corps, so everybody circled in Udamni, and to the east, would break out, regroup at Hugarui. They would march south through the valley to Hungnam, and again, this seemed to be a nearly impossible goal. Like they could, they were heavily outnumbered. It was cold. Supplies were running low. There were a lot of Chinese everywhere. And if you're paying attention, RCT-31 had the toughest end of the job. They were the ones most heavily outnumbered. They had high amounts of wounded from the battle and from the weather. They were running low on ammunition too. And to make it even more difficult, Chinese reinforcements arrived in their area. And to absolutely add the cherry on top, nearby companies that could have assisted in their breakouts were ordered south to defend Hugaruri. So RCT-31 was all by themselves. So pretty fun for them. And at midnight, the Chinese would launch another assault on RCT-31 just to merely destroy them. RCT-31 were able to repel all the assaults with their anti-aircraft guns. They managed to survive the assault just barely and began to prep their breakout in the morning. At Udamni, the Marines' plan for their breakout was to penetrate the Chinese blockade in south, at Tokten Road, rendezvous with the rest of the corps at Hugarui. They faced incredibly tough resistance from opposing Chinese soldiers. The Chinese were in no better condition from their foreign counterparts. They were, hungry, tired, and frostbitten. Despite this, they forced the main column of the Marines to dig in along the hilly roads. However, to the east of the road, a company of Marines were able to flank the Chinese in the morning of December 2nd and opened the way for the Marines to escape the encirclement with the help of air power. Air power was incredibly important. Air power, the planes would drop supplies, provide air support. So they were incredibly clutch for the Marines, crucial. So with the help of air power, air power and the flanking maneuvers, the way to Hugaruri was open. But as you probably already figured out, the Chinese were not going to make the march easy. No, sirree. Ambushes and roadblocks were set up in order to slow down the march. So like a tree or like metal or whatever, scraps large enough to block a road or make crossing difficult would be thrown in or cut down. And this would block the advancing U.S. column, and Chinese soldiers, would then, launch ambushes along the road. Despite this, Marines and the other units from Udamni arrived at Hugarui on December 4th. Back to RCT-31 in the east, at the same time of the breakout at Udamni, they started their breakout operation and tried to urgently push south. As in Udamni, they were blocked by Chinese units. It gotten so bad, they ordered the Air Force to drop napalm to clear the path open. The napalm bombs did indeed decimate the Chinese soldiers blocking the way, but some Americans were unfortunately also caught in the explosions. The convoy started to advance again, but the Chinese were stubborn and they slowed progress once again. It was so stubborn. The Chinese were so stubborn that one ambush killed or wounded all of the unit's truck drivers. Yeah, like they were going down the road, with drivers. It was slow because of the cold and all that. But the Chinese, they would just open fire on the drivers. All of them were killed in one ambush, which is crazy. And the convoy reached yet another roadblock. The Lieutenant Colonel of RCT-31, Don Carlos Faith Jr., had enough of this and he charged a roadblock with the team. They were able to clear the roadblock, but at the cost of Faith's life, who was blown up by a grenade. RCT-31 reached Hugaruri, but decimated and were nearly disintegrated by the ordeal. So, about 2,000 soldiers were originally part of 31. 1,051 of that count reached Hugaruri, but only 385 of that 1,000 were considered combat ready. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. RCT-31 was given the moniker Task Force Faith after the late colonel. So while the breakouts were happening at Udamni and the eastern side, soldiers at Hugarri were busy defending up Chinese attacks and constructing an airfield. The airfield was finished on December 1st, and reinforcements and supplies were immediately flown in. The wounded and dead were also airlifted out, and by December 4th, all units in the area were regrouping at Hugarri. After a 2-day break, to regroup, treat wounded, just basically reorganize and just rest. The breakout would continue. So the plan now was to advance through the river valley to the port of Hunan, where they would be evacuated by the Navy. The Chinese commander, Sung Shilin, would launch yet another night attack from all directions on Hugarri to slow down the Marines and capture the vital point. UN forces repulsed the attack, inflicting a high toll on the Chinese. The Marine advance broke through the blockading Chinese troops and continued until they reached the vicinity south of Kotori during the next day. During this whole time, Chinese divisions were incredibly low on manpower. As I alluded to before, they had poor logistics, and since the American advance, since they crossed the 38th parallel, the UN advance rather, crossed the 38th parallel so quick, the Chinese were actually weren't expecting the American everybody to cross, and they didn't equip the Chinese soldiers with winter clothing. So they just had normal uniforms on, but not thick or warm enough to care for the men. So many got frostbite, hypothermia, and even froze to death. And further manpower was sapped from divisions because they were, daily they were launching assaults, ambushes, and raids, and other operations that the Chinese command wanted to be carried out. So, as it was brutal for the UN soldiers, it was brutal for the Chinese. It was even more brutal, rather, for the Chinese divisions. And Song Shilin wanted to launch one final attempt to encircle and destroy the UN forces once and for all. He was determined. He wanted to do this once and for all. So along the advance, he ordered his forces to dig in on strategically important hills alongside the road or on the road, and they blew up the only bridge on the road connecting, Chosin on the road to the port. The Marines, they had no choice. They had to attack the hills. The assault was obviously not easy. He had to go up hundreds of feet of hills, mountains, in the cold, attacking a fanatic, almost fanatical enemy. But the hills, they were seized. Since the Chinese were low on manpower, this was an important factor for the UN forces in their assaults to break out. So a company was sent to flank the hills. The flank mission, near Udamni, it worked. But the Chinese soldiers, they fought to the last man. So they were flanking from the sides, and a Marine battalion, along with our good old friends in Task Force Faith, attacked the bridge from the north. And little resistance was actually met, which surprised them. When they got closer to the bridge, they found that the Chinese troops were almost all frozen to death. So they're sitting in foxholes and other entrenchments, waiting, and they froze. Just sitting there, frozen to death. So while the Chinese were cleared nearby the bridge, air support flew in the portable bridges, so the engineers will be able to repair the bridges or set up new ones, so the 10th Corps can retreat. Again, Chinese, true to form, constantly sent raiding parties, but they were easily beaten back by UN forces. It was barely sizable raids at all. So The bridges were finished on December 9th, and the entire army left on the 11th and reached Hungnam during the night. The frozen hell was over. Assembled at the port were fresh UN and Korean troops ready to defend the evacuation. The Navy, about 193 warships, were assembled in the harbor, ready to do the job, ready to do the work. Besides the UN forces there, a lot of Korean refugees were following the soldiers, about 40,000 in all. So along with the soldiers, refugees and equipment must be transported as well. But everybody doesn't really take much to figure out. Everybody wanted to get out there quickly as possible. Even though they decimated the Chinese forces at Chosin, at the reservoir, at Chosin Reservoir, more Chinese divisions were arriving. But for some reason during this whole time, they didn't attack. But the army and refugees didn't know that at Hunam, so they were trying to get there out of there quickly as possible. So they arrived there on the 11th, and they got out of there on the 24th of December, so a day before Christmas. So rather than a Christmas offensive, it was a Christmas evacuation. But I bet it was a Christmas miracle for the guys on ground. But actually, a lot of the ships there didn't have enough carrying capacity theoretically. There was this one cargo ship. It was only designed to carry 12 passengers. But everybody wanted to get out of there, and 14,000 refugees were actually stacked on the cargo ship. Yeah, the cargo ship that can only carry 12 was able to take in 14,000 refugees. So, yeah, pretty tight schedule and space on the ship. After they left on the 24th, on Christmas, the Chinese forces arrived in Hungnam, but they found the port to be completely empty of UN forces, and the port was destroyed, so the Chinese and North Koreans wouldn't use it. The Navy, the fleet, they would go down to Busan again to fight another day. Casualties were high on both sides. Around a combined total of 10,495 U.S. Marines, infantry, Koreans, and British Marines were killed in the battle. Further estimated 7,388 combatants were killed by the harsh cold, so bringing the total to around over 17,000 out of 30,000. The Chinese suffered more from the cold and hunger than combat, as I said before. Only about 19,202 were killed in combat, while a whopping, get ready to hear this, 28,954 perished from the cold and hunger. Yeah. So they bring about a grand total of over 48,000 soldiers, Chinese soldiers of the 9th Army were dead. Just think about that. About 120,000 Chinese soldiers. So it was the 9th Army. So 120,000. And I believe that 48,000 is more than a quarter of the army were killed. And more so from the cold and hunger itself. It just astounds me. It was so bad that the 9th Army, they had to wait 3 months to fully receive reinforcements and more people and proper winter clothing this time, I probably bet. So it was really rough for the Chinese soldiers. So you might be waiting for the victor or loser, the outcome of the battle, and it's disputed. It could be interpreted as a Chinese victory, though, because they forced the UN 10th Corps to retreat, and they occupied Chosin, so they could continue with their intervention offensive. But again, the Chinese suffered heavy casualties, and they allowed the 10th Corps to escape the encirclements. The Battle of Chosin also sapped so many men from the rest of the front lines. So if 48,000 didn't die at Chosin, and that 48,000 was committed against the rest of the front lines, that would be even more pressure against the UN armies. So the result is disputed. You could make an argument for either way, but it's safe to say like a draw or like a strategic victory for America. I think the term is a tactical victory for America and strategic victory for the Chinese, since they eventually forced all the UN soldiers in North Korea to retreat back south of the 30th parallel. Along with the retreat, UN forces will not occupy North Korea ever again. Later on in the war, they would advance into it, but they would be beaten back. And at the end of 1950, throughout 1951, the front line was constantly in flux. North Koreans and Chinese would capture Seoul, but UN forces would recapture it and advance. The Communist forces will beat them back again, capture Seoul, the UN forces will come back, so on and so forth. That was the dominant story of 1951. But in 1952 and 1953, so the last 2 years of the war, it was stalemated at the 38th parallel, so like where the border is today. So early on in the war, it was constantly fluctuating, while later in the war, it was stalemate, which continues to this day. And if you ask some military experts or military historians or U.S. Army scholars or whatever, some of them would tell you that Chosin has been the most brutal battle in modern military history. Soldiers were tested by the daily and sub-zero temperatures and surviving the battles, of course. The the veterans that made it out of the frozen hell were known as the chosen few. And let us not forget their incredible perseverance. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I highly appreciate for everybody having the patience and some of them bugging me to create a second episode. I know this second episode wasn't about Machiavelli as I planned, but maybe in a future one. Hopefully I can create the upload schedule to be more consistent. But again, as some of you may know, I'm in school and I need to do school stuff and a whole bunch of other personal stuff. But I do plan on making the podcast to be more consistent, but expect a lot of wait time, like a few months or so, because I have to put in research for the episode and other stuff. So I highly appreciate everybody for listening to the podcast, and thank you so much, and see you next time.
Flickering stars above, like a dream so soft and sweet, lovers romancing everywhere. Harbor lights are sparkling to the beat of my yearning heart. It's love, it's life, neath the china sky, against the moon softly playing. Songs of plaintive melody, dreamy nights of China. are playing in the evening breeze. Gentle China maid, go there, grieving, longing for her love, sailing his junk on waters far from the shores of home. Oh, jealous love, for that China maid still is in his heart, softly murmuring words of sparkling love.